Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I will be showing you how I paint the sky with clouds in the dreamy and colorful style of Studio Ghibli. I will be using gouache paint as well as poster color for this tutorial, and this will be the illustration that we will be painting towards the end of this tutorial. Please bear with me because this video will be quite lengthy, so let's dive into it. Let's start with the materials. This is my 12 color Knicker poster color set. I basically just put it in this mini palette to keep it simple for me. Next is my Miya Arts mini 50 color set that I custom made myself. Next is paper. I generally use a gouache sketch pad with 160 grams of thickness. This is basically just watercolor paper, but I like this size because it's very easy to finish when I start painting. Next are my brushes. The first is the number 12 flat brush that I love for doing the backgrounds. Next is my flat angular brush in number 6. This is perfect for filling up details as well as making fine lines, as you can see here. Next is my number 4 round brush. Now I use this for fine-tuning details like for the trees, the leaves and stuff. It's perfect for outlining it as well. Last is my number 2 round brush. This is basically the same as the first one, but it's used for the minute details. Next is a container for water. I basically just use a ceramic mug for my water because I used plastic before and I toppled it over, so now I use this instead. For paint palettes, I use really tiny ones like this plastic one here or this ceramic saucer. It's my mom's, I stole it from her because I'm very lazy when it comes to cleanup. And then of course a spray bottle, tissue for wiping excess water, and then a swatch of paper for testing the colors, and then painter's tape. So for this sky and cloud tutorial, I chose this image from Howl's Moving Castle. This is Howl's garden. I chose this because of how simple the clouds were and how simple the shapes are. So in case any of you guys want to follow in real time, you would be able to. Let's begin. So I'm going to be showing you guys how I usually blend the sky to create that dreamy-like gradient with Studio Ghibli. So right now I'm using my ceramic palette and I start with poster color. I personally prefer Knicker poster color when it comes to the backgrounds. If you will ask me to choose between Knicker poster color versus Himi Miya Gouache, I prefer Knicker poster color when it comes to the blending, so I honestly think it's one of the most beginner-friendly paint out there. So I usually start with the white and see how I'm going to be mixing the blue here, how creamy the texture is when it comes to like blending the colors. It's very easy for anyone, just anyone who touched this paint the first time, to create this kind of effect. So once you add white or any two colors, especially with white, it just blends perfectly like this. And then you just activate it with a little bit of water like that, and it literally just glides through the paper. So now once I'm happy with the gradient, I let it dry for a little bit, but not completely. I'm gonna start creating the illusion of the clouds. Now there are many ways to do this. This is just my personal preferred way of doing it. So while the paint is in between the wet and dry, I will start adding the white to it. Why? Because I want to create the shadows of the clouds first. So to create the illusion of realistic clouds, for me at the very least, is you need different shades of the blue and the white overlapping with each other. So this is basically combining the techniques of watercolor and the opaque capacities of gouache together to recreate that kind of impressionistic illusion of how clouds are. Because for clouds, there are no definite shapes, right? It can be any shape that you want. They're basically gas, and they create shapes because of how the gas would layer on top of like the blue sky and how the light reflects on it and stuff. So this is how I recreate that kind of illusion. So see here how it blends nicely to the background. It works out because the different layering creates the illusion of that kind of gassy like dreamy cloud and soft cloud. So if you will notice, I absolutely love using the flat brushes. I use the natural shape of the brush to create the shapes of the clouds. I don't like the perfectly curved shape of clouds. They just make it look cartoony. Whereas if you use the shape and dab it around all over the paper like this, it recreates some sort of natural curves or points and stuff that recreate that realistic look. So now I'm gonna start adding the shadow. I shifted to my flat angle brush to create the shadows. Now I'm using some sort of shade of like a buttery yellow to recreate the shadow. I don't have a reference photo for this illustration. I made this for the purpose of this tutorial, and I didn't create a specific source of light, because when it gets too technical, people just tend to get overwhelmed and get scared of actually painting. What's more important for me is an artist starts out by learning how to play with the colors, with the light and the shadows. Forget about lighting in the beginning. You're gonna learn that over time once you continue painting and you develop your own style. And what's more important is that you're not scared to put dark colors to create the shadows and when to use the light colors to create highlights and stuff. So these are just imaginary impressionistic colors. Now I'm going to be using some sort of lilac shade. I mixed purple with a little bit of the buttery yellow that I made to create more shadow and depth to the clouds and have that surreal and dreamy-like look. Now I'm going to start adding the highlights. Sometimes I would go over the shadows to create another layer to create that illusion of like the different layering and shapes of the clouds to make it even more realistic. So sometimes if you think your work doesn't look good, I suggest you take a break and look away for maybe a few minutes and then look back, and then you're going to start seeing the illusions that you're trying to recreate with your impressionistic painting. So now looking at it from afar, it looks more real. Now let's try to recreate a similar scene, but this time using the Miya Arts gouache. So I'm using this cool blue shade. I don't exactly remember what it's called, but it comes in the Himi Gouache 56 color set. So I start with the blue using my flat brush as usual because it just helps cover the area a lot faster than a round brush would. After the blue, I put the white in because technically the shade in the 56 color is already it's exact and I'm happy with it already. All I have to do is make it a little bit lighter, but in terms of shade, it is what it is already versus the 12 color set where I would have to recreate the kind of shade that I want first. So that's why I love having all these 56 colors because like I said, I'm a lazy artist in general and I hate cleanup. And mixing colors just takes so much time, so I love having everything just out there already. But I recreated this smaller palette because it's such a hassle to use that giant set. So here I'm using the same blending technique that I was using earlier, and once I'm happy with that, I'm gonna start adding the clouds. So now I'm gonna be adding the clouds using the white. So using the same flat brush, I'm gonna start using the natural shape of the brush to recreate different shapes, some pointy, some curved, some rounded, to create the illusion of the clouds. Now, compared to the poster color earlier, this one doesn't blend as creamy as the knicker poster color, but it also is a lot easier to create an impressionistic style because relative to poster color, I think the gouache, the Miya gouache, is relatively more opaque because it doesn't get activated as fast and it doesn't dilute as fast when you add water. So see how you're also still able to create gradients, but the shadows are much more prevalent. So I'm going to be using the same white from the gouache, that's why I like combining the two, to add the brighter highlights to recreate my clouds. Those are the areas where the lighting is. That's why I told you guys earlier, don't worry too much about lighting in the beginning, because later on you'll get a feel of what to add and when to add, and if you need to add certain highlights and stuff. So in this case, I felt like there was a need to add more highlights to the previous painting, which I did. So the painting pops out more when you add extreme highlights and when the shadows are already fixed and stuff. So just bear with the long video, but this is really how it is. It really takes time. Of course, you're gonna speed up more, but since this is a tutorial, I had to be a little bit more precise, and quite frankly, I was a little obsessive over it. But I hope you guys are learning something, and I hope I'm able to share what I know. Okay, so the reason why I also did that is because I was waiting for this one to dry a little faster. So now I'm gonna add the highlights like that to create the illusions. So the one on the right will be even more so impressionistic because of the blending limitations of the Miya Arts gouache. But nonetheless, it's gonna create a different kind of illusion. It really depends on you which one you would prefer. But I love both. I love working with both. So I just dab on highlights. This is me trying to figure out which one looks good, how I'm gonna create the shape of the cloud this time, because this one is different from the other one. I think this one I was trying to recreate the cloud from Howl's Moving Castle already. But this time it's literally floating on the sky and it doesn't have like the ground and the mountains and stuff. This is exactly why I love the flat brushes, because depending on how you would hold it and how you would wipe it on the paper, you're able to recreate more natural shapes, in my opinion. Because there are points, there are lines, there is like a flat shape that you can recreate quite fast. I actually just learned to use the flat brush when I started painting using gouache. I never really used it for my watercolor paintings before. But now that I have tried it, there's no turning back. So here, I'm already adding the shades of yellow as usual. Why do I naturally turn to yellow? Because in color theory, yellow works well with blue. So it's the color complement of blue. And even if you don't know the color theory, you would know that there would be reflections of yellow because of the sun. So that adds to the realistic and impressionistic look of the Ghibli painting. So now I mixed a darker shade of the blue by adding gray to it. And then I'm gonna use it to recreate different shadows inside the cloud. So as you can see here, even if it's in the highlights, I'm not scared to add shadows because it creates drama on the painting, especially on the clouds. Once I'm happy again with the shadows, then I play around with the highlights. And to create the highlights, I use less water. So if there's one thing you have to remember with gouache, the more water you add, the more transparent it becomes. And the less water that you use, the more opaque it is, meaning the thicker the color and the more vibrant it is to be applied on the paper. So when I add the highlights using the light colors, then I don't put as much water. The only time I put water is when it doesn't glide on the painting. If it's too thick, then you're not going to be able to wipe it properly on the paper, and it's going to create textures. But depending on the style that you want to go for, it's okay to have texture, so it's really up to you. Here's my finished product. I'm relatively happy with this. Now if you think that it's ugly from up close, check it out from afar. See how it looks more natural from afar like this. You have to remember that when you create a painting, you're not looking at it from up close. You have to look at the bigger picture. So now let's apply what we learned from the clouds on this painting. The first thing I do is I create a horizon line. So if you guys will notice, I don't like sketching using pencil. Why? Because I get frustrated and I turn into a perfectionist and I eventually stop working on my painting. So what I did, I started sketching using my brush. So I basically just get the quote-unquote basic shapes and I start from there. So the first thing that I always identify is the horizon line. And then from there, I can have some sort of guide where to put the biggest shapes, like the mountains or the clouds or the river, the pond, or the bodies of water that are included in the illustration. So I hope this tutorial will be able to help you see how my whole process is and how it really does take time, but not too much time to the point that you wouldn't be able to finish it in one sitting. I try as best as I can. When I start on one painting, I finish it right away because I have this bad habit of not finishing things when I don't finish it in one sitting. So I'm trying to break that habit, which is why I am trying to block off these shapes here because I'm scared that I would forget which is which later on. It's just to remind myself where it gets separated, and because there's like a shadow or a reflection of the clouds that we will be recreating in this painting. So here we go. And we're going to be applying what we learned from the previous tutorial onto the painting. So it's up to you which one you would choose. I just prefer the natural color of the knicker poster color, which is why I think I will be using this one. So for this painting, since I will be needing more paint, I prepare a little bit of it on my palette. That way I'm not gonna mess up my paint palette. So as usual, like earlier, I start with the blue and then water it down a little bit and then add the white. It's gonna blend perfectly and smoothly to the nice shade of the sky that I want. As usual, I am using my flat brush in number 12. You don't have to use the same brushes, it's just that this is what I prefer. And if it helps, then feel free to try it out and see how it works for you. Again, I don't like overthinking things. So basically, I also just go with the flow. If it's too light, then it's very easy for you to correct something. Or if it's too dark, it's still very easy for you to correct something later on. Don't be scared. That's what I love the most about gouache and poster color compared to watercolor. Acrylic, you can achieve a similar result, but acrylic dries permanently, so there's no way for you to really correct it besides covering it up, and so the paint gets thicker. But with gouache, there is always a way to fix things. That's why I'm so in love with this medium. Not to mention, I finally found the medium with the vibrant colors that I loved so much, so I'm sticking to them. So since there's gonna be a reflection, I'm gonna be painting the same shade, if not darker, for the... Is this a pond or a lake? I think it's a lake from Howl's Garden. So that's what I'm gonna be doing now. Darker shade because it's water, and because that way it's usually the darker color that will have a reflection. So the darker the shade of the water, then the higher the chances and the better chances that there will be a reflection of whatever is on the sky. So I love that dramatic effect. That's why I chose this shade. And plus, you know, even if it's the wrong shade right now, it's very easy to correct later on. After painting the lake, I thought that it's too light, at least my sky is, so now I'm going to be adjusting it. So this is what I mean by don't be scared about making a mistake in like the shade or anything, because it's just so easy to fix. Your only hindrance in actually learning how to paint in gouache, poster color, or painting in general is the fear of actually starting and doing it. The mistakes will happen, and that's how you learn the medium, and that's how you will master how to work around it in your own style. So just don't be afraid. Alright, now let's start with the clouds. In every painting that I make, I take the longest actually in painting the sky, the clouds, and the mountains. It's usually those backgrounds that take so much time, because I don't know, for some reason I think that once you get those major natural looking objects and part of the scenery, it just brings everything together, because probably that's one of the main focal points. I guess it depends. For me, I try to identify which part of the scene are the main focal points, or the things that draw attention to the whole picture. And for me, one of those things would be the clouds, which is why, let's say if I paint in an hour, I take about 30 to 40 minutes in actually just doing the background, and everything else in the foreground, especially with a landscape like this, just takes about 20 minutes or so. But I'm not saying I just did this in 1 hour, okay? This one took about an hour and a half, I think. So I'm basically here applying what I showed you in the previous part of this tutorial. I try to identify the major areas of the main shape of the clouds. So I'm trying to give myself like the borders or like the outline, but an invisible one. I try to identify the highlights first. That way it would be easier for me to maneuver around later on, because here I'm trying to build the shadows first. I always put the lightest layers for last. another tip I can give you guys is when you're working with gouache, you know how in watercolor you start with the lightest colors. Sometimes with gouache, depending on the kind of look that you're going for and depending on the thing that you're painting, it's best to start with the shadows first, because it's much harder to put darker shades on, let's say, white, because the white will dilute the darker color. That's why I always, more often than not at least, start with the shadows. But again, it's a case-to-case basis. But most of the time, especially with the clouds, I start with the darker colors before going with the lighter colors. So now I'm adding the lighter colors on the shadows as I try to build up the layers. So again, I work in between the drying and semi-wet part of the gouache when I do the shadows. Now it takes a while for you to get used to where to do it or when to do it. But over time, the more you keep using the paint, then the better you will get at figuring out what works together and what not. So here, the reason why I use both my Nicker and the Miya Gouache is I love the blending and the base colors of the Nicker poster color. So to speed up my color mixing, I combine the two. So let's say I like that shade of the Nicker poster color for the blue, and in order to get like a more of an ashy blue from my Miya Gouache set, there's one here, and that's the one that I use to recreate the shadow, instead of me, mixing together the black, the purple, and then the blue together to get that perfect shadow shade for the cloud. So that kind of speeds up my process. I'm not saying that you should be doing this, but this is what worked out for me to speed up my painting process. Because one thing you also have to realize is you have to figure out what kind of artist you are. What are your weaknesses? What encourages you to paint? What stops you from it? So in my case, what stops me is that it takes so much from my day, and that really, really frustrates me. So I tried to figure out ways that will speed things up for me. That way, it's gonna be more encouraging for me to do more paintings like these. So for one, I don't work on huge paper to speed up the painting process and to make sure I finish one work in one sitting. I also hate cleanup, which is why, as you can see, my setup is so tiny. I have a tiny palette, I have tiny sources of paint, and basically everything is laid out. I hate the part where I would have to squeeze out the paint from the tubes. So this brilliant idea of the gouache sets, I really, really loved it so much. The only catch was they were too big. So I found a workaround it. So thankfully now they create these beautiful multiple well empty palettes. And I was able to recreate my own palettes that will work for my kind of style. So here, if you will notice, I'm starting to add shades of green. This is like an ashy olive green because it's in, so the clouds are on top of like a field of grass, right? And it's green. So logically speaking, you would expect that there will be reflections on the cloud as well, just as there is a reflection onto the water. So one thing that you guys have to keep in mind is that light and color bounces on top of each other, especially on white. Whereas with black absorbs the color. white will help you reflect the color that is surrounding it. So that's how I, set my mind when it comes to using black and white. And one other tip that I can give you that my professors used to tell me before is that as much as possible, you will use black the least. It's the last color that you will use in any kind of painting. So more often than not, when it comes to using like a black, I would prefer to use like a midnight blue or a dark navy blue or a dark purple or maybe indigo. And then I mix it with a little bit of black to make the indigo a little bit darker. So once I'm relatively happy with the shadows, I'm gonna start adding the highlights using the white. This time when I add the lighter colors like the white, then I start to wait for the under layers to dry up first before adding them, because when you put something on a wet surface, then it's gonna blend with the colors underneath. But once it's dry and you use a more concentrated pigment, then it's gonna literally cover up whatever is underneath, and that's gonna create that dramatic effect. So see how it's starting to finally take a little bit of shape? So even if I finish, let's say, this whole cloud area, it wouldn't look as nice as when you finally finish the whole thing. So sometimes, I don't know if you guys will believe me, but the worse it looks in the beginning, the better it really looks once it's finished and everything is put together. So sometimes, let's say when you're starting out like this, it's natural to feel frustrated that it doesn't look good, it doesn't look like a cloud. But the thing is, you guys have to understand that you haven't even painted everything else that will build the picture to make it look like what it's supposed to look like. And the goal is never to make an exact photocopy or a picture copy of the painting. The reason why for me it's a painting is because it's a recreation of an actual work. If you want a photorealistic copy of, let's say, this beautiful painting from Howl's Moving Castle, then why not just print it out? Every artist has their own way of expressing themselves, and I feel that it's that part or that aspect of painting that makes a painting. And I guess it's what goes on in your mind and how you express it. Because for me, if there's one thing that I learned when I started, posting my artworks on social media, especially my processes, it's usually the paintings that I make where, I don't know, I actually, let's say I have a bad day or I had a terrible day or I feel very emotional and stuff. Even if it's just a recreation of a piece of work of somebody else, it's the one that, I don't know, people watch more, and the things that go viral, it's actually very fascinating. So I think it's the emotion, the emotional part of the painting that is, I don't know, painted across the canvas that people connect to sometimes. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just guessing, because so far that has been the pattern. So now, since I have the basic idea of where the clouds are, I'm gonna start creating the shadow. So after working on the reflection, now I'm gonna be starting to work on more highlights to emphasize the bright shades on the clouds. So that pretty much sums up my whole process of layering and adding colors. And right now, it's starting to take shape based on my experience. But for some people, I know that it might be discouraging. But this is what I mean by once you start adding the details, it's going to start popping up, sinking down, and create the whole picture. So one portion of your image will not create the whole picture. You will start to see its full beauty once you start adding the details like this. And that's what I love so much about gouache. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. If you guys have questions, feel free to comment them down below. And if you have suggestions for other tutorials, what you guys want to learn, please comment them down and I would be more than happy to add them to the list of things that I want to make a video out of. Thank you guys so much for watching and see you guys next time.